We tried to make it really where any church could copy it, where any Bible study, any group could copy it and go on. So he looks at modern proofs for God, and the idea behind this, the outline that we want to follow, is we're going to start out from the context of, does God even exist, and what's the proof for God existing, and things like that. And then we're going to look at, okay, if he does exist, who says that the Bible is accurate? Who says that it's true? Where does it come from? Is it accurate? What was written 2,000 years ago, is that what we still have now? So a little bit of apologetics there. And then we'll start eventually moving into some stories about things like some of the stories of the Old Testament. And, the first time I read through the Old Testament, it was shocking and horrible to me. I don't know about y'all, but I went, oh my gosh, there's all these sacrifices, and this is not the God I know, and what in the world is this? And when I studied Instant Brewer stuff, and I learned about Jewish culture and first century Judaism, and I learned about the culture of the Egyptians and the other cultures around the time, Canaan and all that, I had a whole other perspective on the Old Testament, and I hope that you will too. I felt much more warm and fuzzy about it than I did at the time. And so we'll go through that, and then we'll go through some very familiar stories, things like Ruth and David and Noah and things like that, and look at it. Oh, they're cool when you look at it from a context of history and all the evidence that there really is out there. It's fun. It's good stuff. So anyway, when modern physics meets modern philosophy, God becomes necessary. So we're looking at physics versus philosophy. It sounds strange to be true, but it's an inescapable conclusion. Modern physics in and of itself doesn't need God. It can explain anything without him. And modern philosophy doesn't need God either. But when you put them together, philosophy and physics, there are so many things that can't be explained without God. In technical terms, we could say fine-tuning plus multiverse equals God or God. And by fine-tuning of the universe, and I meant to bring the privileged planet, I'll bring it next week, and we'll look at a few little clips from it. We actually got further than I thought we would, so that's good, I guess. I talk too fast. I can slow down anytime you want. But basically, the fine-tuning of the universe is the idea that the universe is so precise, the Earth is so precise, there's so many things, the electromagnetic spectrum, gravity, our place in the universe, and the intergalactic habitable zone. We're not too close to the sun, we're not too far away. The temperature, the tilt of the Earth, it just goes on and on and on. And you look at the statistical odds of all of those things randomly happening on their own, and they don't. They don't. Just mathematically, it's impossible, which is kind of cool. But I have a nice little video clip that I'll show y'all that summarizes all that I showed to my kids at school. So you start with man, who according to the Psalms is the center of the universe. It seems silly nowadays to conclude that man's the center of anything, because when we look up at the stars or the dark night sky and see the vast heaven, and you think of all the other planets that might be inhabited, why should humans be so special? Why should living things even be special? When the huge, vast majority of the universe is nothing but lifeless emptiness. What's so special about life, and which is such a tiny proportion of the universe? And yet, as it turns out, man is central, according to the modern theories of physics. We now know so more about the universe and about matter itself. We can look back in time to billions of years ago by following starlight, and the complex mathematical models show how the atom works are being confirmed. There are so many mysteries left, but nothing is as mysterious as what we found. Because what we have found is that the universe is indeed tailored precisely for us, and possibly for other creatures on very similar planets that are just like us. And we and our kin appear to be the final purpose of the whole universe. Physicists have concluded that the universe is finely tuned for life, and that's some of the things that we talked about. But like I said, I'll show you the clip too next time, and it should be interesting. The laws of science as we know them at present. This is what Stephen Hawking said, by the way, who is an atheist. But the laws of science, as we know them at present, contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge of the electron and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to be very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. And I do find it interesting that he's an atheist. It's also interesting that his quotes are on the main page of the LSD Science website. It's interesting too. Side note. Calculating exactly how fine-tuned the universe is beyond us. We don't yet know how many separate fundamental properties there are. Perhaps there are 26, or a theory of everything may whittle it down to one, and that theory of everything means that all these 26 are comprised into one that encompasses all of them. That's all that means.
Well, let me just mention these vowels real quick, because this is very good visual. So each of these things, like you've got gravity, you've got water content, you've got like the way that lipid membranes work in cells, and all these kind of things, they have to be so precise or else none of this would be here. You wouldn't have single-celled life, much less us or animals or anything. So all this stuff's very precise, and so that's what we're talking about. It's the fine-tuning.
Like a fraction of a percent off, and that would be it. If we were 5% closer to the sun, we would burn up. If we were 20% further away, we'd freeze to death. I mean, it's amazing. So anyway, present calculations suggest, we don't know exactly how exact each one of them needs to be, but present calculations suggest that it's in the realms of billions to one or more. But no one knows exactly how fine-tuned the universe is. There may be other possible life forms, but this only reduces the odds a little. Most possible universes don't even contain heavy atoms or planets. So the principle stands firm: our universe is extremely fine-tuned for life. Now, a multiverse is an infinite series of possible universes in which all exist together. Now, personally, I don't believe in this, but it's kind of interesting. This is where he's talking about psychology, and this is where he's talking about there is another theory saying that there are an infinite number of universes, and he's not saying he believes in this either, but you should know that it's out there. But,
this is in dimensions, different dimensions?
Right, basically. Like, they all exist together, so there's so many that anything is possible. And this is actually like a legitimate theory, that's taught and things like that. But it's called a multiverse. And I promise for you non-science people, the first few lessons are very sciencey, then we get more history-ish, so hang on, we'll get there. But anyway, so every possible form of the universe which could exist does exist. That's this theory. And they all exist simultaneously because they are all self-contained. They're not next to each other because space is an artifact of matter. They exist in their own space, completely separate and independent from ours. So in that theory, anything is theoretically possible. These aren't parallel universes like in popular fiction with people just like us. The vast majority of the universes have physical laws completely different to ours, but all the physical constants like gravity, electromagnetic forces, things like that are different. So in that, the idea is if you have enough of something, you eventually get to the right combination. But anyway, each has a randomly different setup, and only small proportions contain matter. So if you use your imagination about the types of life which could theoretically exist, think about the film Avatar. The planet Pandora has a god which turned out to be real in the movie, and the people who die go to join that god, and they survive, and they're able to talk to the living. Did y'all ever see the movie? Okay. It turns out that the god is actually the planet's plant life, which is all connected, and the roots underground form a single neural network like a planet-sized brain. The single mind is vastly larger and more complex than the human brain, so the people of the planet and the humans have this huge mind that's like God. And so, anyway, it's kind of a theory similar to that. Now, imagine a universe which is significantly different from ours, where a single individual spans not only the surface of the planet, but all matter, where the whole universe and all of its forms is linked together into a single mind. Not just one planet, but all the planets, and they aren't scattered but joined. The mental thought isn't limited to the speed of neurons, but to the speed of light, and this mind encompasses and controls all other matter in the universe. So that moving matter or making things is just like a process of extended thinking. There would be no death or life for the being and no limit to what it could do. An individual like that would discover the multiverse much quicker than we did. And long before, he'd work it out to make a new universe within the multiverse, and how to make extensions of his own universe, which appeared to be separate. Just by thinking he could make things exactly as he wanted them to be, he'd make a complex universe with less effort than we could make ripples in a pond. And if he didn't like the patterns, he could change them with effortless will. And what would he make? Perhaps he'd make beings who could think like him. So the idea, what he's doing is he's taking this theory of the multiverse, and he's saying, rather you go from physics, which is the realm I like better, and think of it as the fine-tuning, or you go from like this psychology idea of this multiverse, you come back to the same conclusion, which is God. And if he didn't like the patterns, he could change them with effortless will. And what would he make? He might make beings like us. So that could communicate with him and develop further still. Rather, we love the idea of making computers which think for themselves, and we like to imagine that one day that they would talk back. Now, I'm not saying that this describes what God is or that the multiverse exists. In fact, I don't think a multiverse does exist. But, like we said, and we'll talk about a lot of different theories and ideas and things like that. But if the infinite multiverse exists, then God would have to exist because all possibilities would exist. So if you have the fine-tuning, you would have to eventually get to God because mathematically it's impossible that everything randomly happens. If you go with the multiverse theory, then you would have to eventually get back to God because all possibilities exist.
And we just happen to be in the one where everything worked out right.
Right.
We just
There-
happen to
there you
be
go.
in that multiverse or in
Right.
that universe.
In that particular one. What if the multiverse doesn't exist? Then we're stuck with the finely tuned universe. And if this is the only universe in, that it's fine-tuning, then it has to have a designer, right? If you have the fine-tuning, then you've got to end up with a designer. So either way, we're forced to conclude that a God exists to create the universe, either by the fine-tuning, by someone or something, or as part of an infinite multiverse, which also must contain a godlike being. So you have fine-tuning plus multiverse equals God or God. And this is a big problem for atheists. So what do atheists actually think about this? What about Richard Dawkins? Anybody know who Richard Dawkins is? He's not just an atheist, but he's like very anti-Christianity. Stephen Hawking, not quite so much. Richard Dawkins says some some of his quotes that we'll get to, they're not real friendly. Okay, so what does Richard Dawkins think? Well, surprisingly, he agrees with all the above, even the conclusion, mostly. This is what he wrote in The God Delusion, which is a book that he wrote, and you have a link to it if you want it. But he agrees that the universe is finely tuned in an extraordinary way. He said, physicists have suggested that the laws and constraints of physics are too good, as if the universe were set up to favor our eventual evolution. It is as though we were, say, half a dozen dials representing the major constants of physics. Each of the dials could, in principle, be turned to a wide range of values. Almost all of these knob twiddling would yield a universe in which life would be impossible. You can estimate the very low odds against the 6 knobs, all just happening to be correctly tuned, and conclude that a divine knob twiddler must have been at work. But that explanation begs the biggest question of all. The divine knob twiddler would himself have to have been at least as improbable as the settings on the knobs. So even Richard Dawkins is saying, it's so finely tuned, it does kind of seem like we have a creator. And when you read some of his quotes, I promise you, he is not pro-creationism at all. His conclusion doesn't say that God exists, but that God-like beings. And we would agree with him that this is not what we believe in. But it's interesting to see how far he's pushed by what we know of physics. And that's what I think is interesting to see when you have people who are, absolute. One of my best friends is an atheist, but she's not a staunch atheist where, she is out to really annihilate all thoughts of creationism. Richard Dawkins in his quotes and in his stuff is truly on that end of the spectrum. And so when even he says, it looks like something or someone had to do this, that means something. And we would agree with him, which is the same. I know I'm jumping off a little, whatever you want to call it, small cliff here. But the thing that Instone Brewer does that I really like in looking at a lot of his things when we get to Jesus and looking at Jesus and the life of Jesus and the resurrection and his death and crucifixion and the miracles that he does kind of the same way of looking at those who were against Jesus, what did they say about him kind of thing, which I think is interesting because I think when you learn what those who didn't have the agenda of promoting it but are actually pushing against it, what they believe, then I think it's very, a good legitimate way to look at it. Does that make sense? I'm probably, I don't know. Sorry, rambling. I'll stop. Okay, so anyway, in the end, he says that the existence of God isn't impossible, but it's improbable. Just as the existence of a universe fine-tuned for life is also improbable. Then he acknowledges that a multiverse would make the fine-tuning possible, but without acknowledging that this changes the existence of God into a certainty. Because if you did have a multiverse, then the idea, the absolute, the theory of a multiverse is that there are so many universes that everything that could possibly exist does exist. And so that in and of itself, by definition, you would have to have God exist. The philosophers will continue to do what they do best. They'll argue and theorize, and we will stand on the sidelines and understand one word in 10. But it's interesting to see how hard it is for a serious philosopher to remove God. And it's even harder for someone like Dawkins to seriously deal with the issues. Perhaps they'll come up with an alternative theory which doesn't need God, like those they have before, and then they found out about the fine-tuned universe. In other words, for many, many years before we knew so much about the universe, many scientists would say we don't, well, actually, let me start with this. Early on, we've gone through multiple stages. Early on, scientists like Galileo and Newton and Pascal, like the really famous scientists, they believed in God. In fact, they thought that it was a theological quest. If you learned about science, you learned about God. And that's kind of where I stand. And then we went through a phase where we said, oh, we don't need God. It's kind of secularism and things like that. And then we started learning more about the universe and the fine-tuning of the universe and the fact that we actually only know, like matter, atoms, matter that we know accounts for about 15% of the universe. The other 85% we can't account for, which is really stinking cool. But we'll get to that. It's called dark matter and dark energy and stuff, but it's what they name it just because they don't know what to call it. But so we're kind of moving into that realm now. If we're going, well, there's so much we can't explain and the universe is so fine-tuned, maybe there is something to this God thing. And that's kind of the place where we're at now. So that's what he's talking about. By the way, that's a picture of Richard Dawkins. So if you're curious who that is, not my family vacation or anything. Although I don't think I look like either one of the women up there, so that's okay. So we continue. Okay, like those that they had before found out about the fine-tuned universe. So perhaps discovering something more will make atheism probable again, until we discover even more and find out that God's existence is even more probable. As Christians, of course, we don't need to prove the existence of God, and perhaps the concept of faith means that proof is unattainable or undesirable. And are we supposed to collect all the facts and then add a little faith to top it off? The theory of gravity is still a theory, awaiting irrefutable proof, but of course I believe it because it affects me. And the theory of evolution is still a theory. It's a much younger theory than gravity, but I believe it as well. The theory of God's existence is still a theory, older than the others, and I believe it. Of the three, gravity and God stand out as different because I feel their effects on me. I can attest to all the things God's done in my life, true miracles. I mean, oh my goodness, I could stand up here. I gave my testimony in church on Wednesday night, I guess maybe a month or two ago, and I went on for like an hour. It was a really long service. Nobody left. They were nice, but and that was like the shortened version because God's done so much in my life. So I can see the effect. I can feel the effect of gravity. I totally believe in those two. Evolution, personally, I believe in. I don't care whether y'all do or not. It doesn't make me a bit of difference. But I can't feel the personal effects on me. So I say, so to say I believe it, it's a much more personal statement or testimony whenever we're talking about God or gravity. Whereas the theory of evolution is just like a story which fits the facts. It doesn't necessarily contradict the Bible, so I have no reason to reject it. And we'll look at that too. We'll look at the exact wording. Stay with me. If you hate evolution, it's okay. I promise I'll let you talk. And I really, like I said, I was at one point on this end and now I'm on this end. And the whole class isn't about that. So please don't run in the opposite direction. Like literally there's like 1 or 2 class periods and that's it. And you totally don't have to agree. I'm in no way trying to get everybody to agree. Our goal as the leadership team, I guess, is to get the conversation going and to get facts out there and to really help us as parents and as people prepare the best that we can to talk to our kids about the things that they're learning. But I don't feel so personally wedded to it as the reality of gravity and God. So is man the center of the universe? Yes, if God made the universe. Which, of course, I do believe that he did. So that said, next time we'll look at the little clips of the fine-tuning and we'll go into the next lesson. Of all the lessons, I will say this is my least favorite. It fits as far as the order goes, but I do think it's the most boring of all of them, which I probably shouldn't get up here and say on the first day. But I say that to say, give us 3 or 4 weeks and see what you think and really get in there because I truly, truly believe with all my heart that we are the groundworks of starting a movement that needs to happen within this church and within other churches. And another really cool side note, I have a friend who works at, it doesn't work out, she goes to Prestonwood Baptist in Dallas. Y'all know anything about that? Huge church. I mean, multiple satellite campuses that have, their choir has 5,000 in it. They have like 20,000 people think of this church, but they're nuts. But they're wanting to start a class mimicked after this class. And I'm hoping that we can continue to kind of, through our friends and our networks, start doing this at a lot of different churches because there's such a huge need for it, in my opinion. So with that, anybody, and I promise we won't talk the whole time, other time. We're kind of ironing out the kinks too, so stay with us. But does anybody have anything that they want to say or pray about or anything before we dismiss and go on our happy lives?
Oh, I was going to say, yes, where this needs to be a national movement or worldwide, really, because, I mean, this, it's ambiguous, to just anyone who would go to a public school and face a situation like what happened with Lubbock ISD, a year ago when there was a one-sided thing going on in the middle schools. But I'd like to see this thing go national.
Worldwide.
That would be
Agreed.
cool. I agree. Any other?
One thing that I've always thought is that, when in looking at the big picture, I kind of like to talk about the big picture of being a social worker.
Mm-hmm.
And I have always felt that the big picture is so big that God really kind of had to dumb it down so that our little pea brains could grab a hold of any of it.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. And when we look at the little evolution part, one of the big questions he asks is not, if you were God, how would you explain this to Moses? Because when you think about Moses, he didn't know about atoms. He didn't know all the things that we know. I mean, he knew his life and his world, and he was a very intelligent man and a far better person than I'll ever be. But he didn't know all the things that we know now, and so how would you explain it? And it is, to me, the kicker is that he got this exact same order, the exact same things in the exact same order, which we'll look at, which is just pretty stinking cool, regardless of which side of the spectrum you're on. So, anyway.
I like your idea, and it's funny as you read more and more about the science thing. It's the thing that gets me is the egotism to say, well, we know it all, but there's plenty of stuff even in this lesson where we only know 15% of the existing elements. There's 85% of it we have no idea. We think we're so smart. We think we have it all figured out. There's so much more that we still
11% of our brain.
Right. So there's more to it. There's definitely more to it.
Hey, Bill, I think it's very scary that this was able to get into any school system, LISD or any other, without the number of parents out.
Saying anything, right?
Outraged. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they don't know, and it's
Well,
laughable.
exactly. How did this,
Right.
how did it get through the curriculum without millions of people in the state just throwing up their hands and going,
Right,
well,
right.
this
Well, and
can't
Channel
happen.
1 is national. Channel 1,
Yeah.
I mean, we're not picking on LSD, I promise. They're who I work for, I don't now, and I might not after this anyway. but no, it's not picking on LSD at all. It's a national thing, and it's very common.
But
you're
it's
right.
been this
lot
way
of
for a
parents don't
long,
know.
long time. I mean, because
Yeah.
when we were in school, the idea of the Darwinism and the evolution and all was taught, and the creation aspect of the world existence wasn't taught. God was still in the school through what we would
Prayer.
say,
You were allowed to
prayer,
pray.
and we were allowed to pray.
Right.
But when it came down to the science class, we weren't taught
We're still
a
excluded.
creationist
Right.
Right.
view.
So for a long time, it's been that way.
So, right.
And the idea is that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And even if we can't teach it in the schools, if we can teach it in the churches and go, okay, whatever side of the spectrum you're on, these really aren't arch enemies, then it takes away that or. It takes away the excuse not to believe in God. Now, you may choose to believe or not to believe, but the excuse is gone, which is kind of what I'm all about.
The other thing is you bump into these people out in the world and they're like, oh, you believe in God, you must be dumb. I believe in science and I can prove it to you, you can prove this stuff. This class may hopefully equip you with some of the ammunition to fight that fight and say, you know what, I disagree and here's why. This, give you some facts and put them on their heels a little bit maybe. And be able to come back at them and say, well, what about this? Put them on the defensive, because we're always so on the defensive. They're like, well, I believe in science because there's evolution and there's this and there's all the table of elements and all this kind of stuff. Maybe there's some information here that we can use to, having more meaningful impact on that discussion.
Back in the late 70s, 80s, there was a tape that I had gotten a hold of. It was a tape from a Texas A&M professor named Bert Thompson, and actually a guy at the Sunset Church of Christ. And he used his science as a basis of his belief in
Which is what early scientists did for
God,
Right.
most of history
and
until
Newton and all that stuff, which I found fascinating way back then. And so I'm really excited for this class
too.
because it's finally, coming about. That we're talking about it in church instead of just whispering about it in the halls.
Right. Right. No, I am too. I think it'll be neat. So, well, I know some of y'all need to get to second service, and so
Right before we go, did
wrap it
everybody
up.
sign in? Next week, maybe we'll put the emails on there so we can start
Yeah, emails
doing
will be
that.
good. Emails will be good. And check out the website.
This
It's on the
is the
back of your
website.
cards. Good stuff on there. But anyway, and please pass those around and all that good stuff. But let me just close this in prayer really super quick, and we'll head out of here. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the turnout. We thank you that you love us. Use us to be the people and the vessels that you've called us to be. We pray in Jesus' holy name. Amen. Okay. Head on out.